Day 53. Nancy Guthrie is still missing, and in the past 48 hours, FBI agents have returned to the Catalina Foothills neighborhood where she lived, not to her home this time, but to the streets surrounding it. Knocking on doors, asking for names, not general descriptions, names, specific contractors, individual workers active at the construction sites near her property during the weeks before she disappeared. The agents are not explaining why. They rarely do. But the precision of that request points towards something more deliberate than a standard follow-up canvas. This is not the first time investigators have gone back to something in this case without explaining why. There is a location on Nancy Guthrie's property that law enforcement has returned to more than once. It has never been publicly identified, not by the Pima County Sheriff's Department, not by the FBI. No agency has stated what they were looking for there. No statement was issued after any of those visits not to confirm a finding, and not to rule one out. That silence has held through multiple returns, through the release of the property back to the family, and through a renewed surge of investigative activity in the last several weeks. What was documented on one of those visits? A long pole, used to probe an underground structure at the rear of the home. Investigators pushed it in repeatedly. A flashlight was directed into the opening below. And then, nothing. No update, no confirmation, no denial. In an investigation with hundreds of assigned agents, a 24-hour command post, and over 13,000 tips logged from the public, the decision not to speak about a specific location is not an oversight. It is a deliberate choice. And in federal investigations of this scale, that choice is made when what was found is still being processed, or when naming it would compromise something the investigation is still building toward. This video is not about who abducted Nancy Guthrie. That answer is not available today. The question this video examines is more specific. Why do search teams keep returning to that one location on her property? And why has every agency involved refused to name it or describe what happened there? To answer that, we are going to look at the documented pattern of returns to that property, what each visit involved, and how it connects to something the Pima County Sheriff confirmed just 2 days ago, a date in January, 3 weeks before Nancy disappeared, that investigators now believe is central to how this crime was planned. That date has been mentioned briefly in most coverage. We are not going to mention it briefly. If you are new to this case, stay with us. The next section covers everything you need in under 2 minutes. If you have been following since day one, what comes next reframes the timeline in a way most reporting has not addressed. Crime Doc Network covers every confirmed development in this investigation as it happens. Subscribe and turn on notifications because this case is still moving and you want to be here when it does. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She lives alone in Catalina Foothills, an affluent area on the northern edge of Tucson, Arizona. She is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, co-host of NBC's Today Show. That connection brought immediate national attention to her disappearance. It also brought resources hundreds of agents, federal prosecutors, and the full weight of the FBI's Phoenix field office. On the night of January 31st, her son-in-law Tommaso Cioni dropped her off at her home at approximately 9:50 p.m. That was the last confirmed time any family member saw her. The following morning, a church friend noticed she had not appeared for a scheduled service. Family members went to her home around 11 a.m. They searched the house and the grounds. They found no trace of her. At noon, they called 911. What deputies found was not a routine scene. Blood near the front entrance later confirmed through DNA testing to be Nancy's. Her phone still inside, her personal items untouched. The doorbell camera had been deliberately disabled. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos described conditions inside the home as, quote, very concerning. Homicide detectives were called in the same day. By February 2nd, the case had officially become a criminal investigation. Authorities stated they believed Nancy had been taken against her will. On February 10th, the FBI released surveillance footage from the doorbell camera before it was disabled. It showed a masked individual male, approximately 5 feet 9 to 10 inches tall, medium build, approaching the front of the home, carrying a weapon and wearing a backpack. He struck the camera before the feed cut out. The FBI described him as armed and dangerous. At least 3 ransom notes were sent to media outlets, including the Tucson station KOLD and TMZ. Demands were for approximately $6 million in cryptocurrency, with deadlines that passed without any confirmed direct contact between the suspected abductor and the Guthrie family. As of today, no arrests have been made. No suspect has been officially named. The immediate family has been cleared. The Guthrie family has announced a $1 million reward. The FBI is separately offering $200,000 for information leading to an arrest. 53 days. No resolution. Here is what most coverage has not fully examined. The investigation's own behavior, specifically, what investigators keep returning to, what they keep avoiding naming, and what that pattern reveals about where this case is actually heading. When investigators return to a location they have already processed, it means one of three things. They found something they need to verify, they missed something the first time, or they found something they are not ready to discuss yet, and they need to go back before they can. In the Nancy Guthrie investigation, the documented returns to her Catalina Foothills property follow a pattern that does not fit routine procedure. The initial processing of the scene began February 1st. That is standard. A crime scene gets worked, documented, and held. What is less standard is what happened after. Within the first 2 weeks, the property was released back to the Guthrie family. Law enforcement had finished what they stated was their primary forensic processing. The family was allowed access. That is typically a signal that the scene itself has yielded what it can yield. Then investigators came back, not a brief follow-up. On February 25th, day 25 of the search, News Nation cameras documented multiple unmarked black SUVs arriving at Nancy Guthrie's residence. More than 6 individuals, some in suits, entered and exited through the garage. Federal prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Phoenix were confirmed to be among them. They remained inside for nearly 3 hours. That is not a courtesy visit. That is a working session at a location someone has decided is still relevant. But that return was not what drew the most specific attention. Several days earlier, around February 16th, investigators were captured on camera in a different part of the property, not the front entrance, which had already produced the doorbell footage, not the driveway, the rear of the home. What was documented? A long pole, inserted into what CNN and WRAL both reported, was an underground tank behind the house. The pole was pushed in repeatedly, not once for a quick probe, but multiple times, at different angles. A flashlight was directed into the opening. The investigator leaned in, looked, adjusted, looked again. No statement followed that activity. Not from the Pima County Sheriff's Department, not from the FBI. The footage existed, the behavior was documented by reporters at the scene, and the agencies said nothing. There is also a detail about the security system at the rear of the property that has not received adequate attention. The cameras Nancy Guthrie had installed at the back of her home, covering the pool area, the side yard, the rear fence line, were motion activated. Those cameras were recovered and reviewed by the FBI. But what agents found was not video footage. It was thumbnails, still images captured by motion triggers, not continuous recording. There is no video from the back of that property for the period investigators most need it. The front of the home produced a few seconds of footage showing the masked figure. That footage has been central to the investigation. The back of the property produced images that, according to ABC News reporting, showed nothing suspicious family members, landscapers, pool workers in the weeks prior. But no night footage. No continuous recording of the area where investigators later spent time probing an underground structure. That is a gap. And it is a gap that someone with advanced knowledge of the security system would have known existed. Then there is the matter of the cadaver dogs. The Pima County Sheriff's Department deployed cadaver dogs early in the search. That deployment was publicly acknowledged. At some point, without announcement, without explanation, the use of cadaver dogs was suspended. Sheriff Nanos confirmed to Fox News Digital that their use had been put on hold, adding they were available if needed in the future. That is a carefully worded statement. It does not say the dogs found nothing. It does not say the search of the property is complete. It says the dogs are on standby. In missing persons cases, cadaver dogs are deployed when investigators need to determine whether a victim is still alive. Their suspension mid-investigation, without an accompanying explanation, is not a routine operational update. There is also a utility box near the home that was reported to have been damaged. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed awareness of it. No further information has been released about when the damage occurred or whether it is considered relevant to the abduction. When you map these details together, the underground tank, the rear camera gap, the returned and then revisited property, the cadaver dogs on standby, what you see is an investigation that keeps circling back to the same part of a property. Not the part with the doorbell camera, not the front entrance. The rear. The part that has no continuous video record. The part no one has named. That pattern raises the central question of this video. It does not answer it. To get closer to an answer, you have to look at something else investigators have documented. Something that reframes not just where Nancy may have been taken, but how this entire operation was built. 53 days in, the FBI has confirmed something that changes the geometry of this crime. There are at least 2 separate images of the suspected abductor taken at Nancy Guthrie's home on different days before the night of January 31st. This person was not passing through. They were not a contractor who glanced at the property. They returned, more than once. And they returned before taking Nancy. That means every analysis of the night of January 31st is incomplete if it begins on January 31st. The operation that resulted in Nancy Guthrie's abduction was built over time. Someone studied this property. They learned the camera positions. They identified the coverage gaps. They noted the iron security gate at the front entrance. And they came back. Multiple times. Until they were ready. That iron gate is worth slowing down on. Because the gate at Nancy Guthrie's front door is a security feature specifically designed to prevent forced entry from outside. Law enforcement sources, as reported by NewsNation, have noted that this gate is nearly impossible to breach from the exterior without substantial equipment or time. The masked individual seen on the doorbell footage was on the outside of that gate. He approached. He struck the camera, and at some point, Nancy Guthrie passed through that entrance. If the gate cannot be forced from outside, and there is no footage of it being forced, then someone was already inside when the masked figure arrived at the front. That is not a theory invented for this video. It is the working hypothesis that investigators themselves have reportedly been examining, according to NewsNation sources familiar with the investigation. The possibility that at least one person was already inside Nancy Guthrie's home when the masked individual approached the door. Think about what that requires. It requires someone who either had a key, had access to a point of entry that was not the front gate, or had been let in before the night in question. It requires coordination. It requires knowledge of the home's interior layout. And it requires planning that started well before January 31st. The mixed DNA recovered from inside the residence, confirmed by Sheriff Nanos to not belong to Nancy. Guthrie, or any member of her immediate circle, is still being analyzed using forensic genetic genealogy. That process can take weeks. It can take months. When it produces a result, it may point to one person. It may point to a family line that investigators then have to work through individually. Meanwhile, that DNA sits as the clearest biological evidence that someone who should not have been inside. Nancy Guthrie's home had been there. Subscribe to CrimeDoc Network and turn on notifications. When the DNA analysis returns a result, when the investigation names that location on the property, we will have the full breakdown within hours, not days. The masked figure at the front door. The accomplice theory inside. The multiple visits in the days prior. And a rear section of the property that investigators keep returning to without explanation. The question this raises is not who yet. The question is when this started. And that answer may be written in a date that the Pima County Sheriff has now. Confirmed matters a date in January that almost no one noticed at the time. A black glove was found approximately 1.5 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. That detail moved through the news cycle quickly when it was first reported. A glove, possible evidence, DNA testing underway. The implication was clear enough that most people understood what investigators were hoping for. The result came back negative on 2 separate counts. The DNA on that glove did not match any profile in CODIS, the FBI-managed combined DNA index system, which holds over 19 million offender profiles from across the country. That alone is not unusual. Not every perpetrator has a prior criminal record, but the second result was more significant. The DNA on the glove did not match the DNA recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home. 2 separate DNA samples, 2 separate individuals, and neither one identified. Investigators were direct about this early on. Sheriff Nanos confirmed that DNA found inside the residence did not belong to Nancy or anyone in her immediate family. That sample remains the strongest biological evidence in the case. The glove, initially flagged because it appeared similar to the type worn by the masked figure in the doorbell footage, is now considered a separate thread, potentially unrelated, still unresolved. The distinction matters, because it means the investigation is tracking at least 2 unidentified biological signatures from 2 different locations, and has confirmed matches for neither. The physical evidence trail from the masked figure himself is also moving slowly. The backpack he was carrying in the surveillance footage has been identified as a model sold exclusively at Walmart. That is a traceable item, but Walmart sells in volume, across hundreds of locations in the Southwest. Narrowing that purchase to a specific transaction requires either a credit card trail or a store camera that captured something useful. Neither has been publicly confirmed. The holster is different. Investigators described it publicly as having unique characteristics. The Pima County Sheriff's Department said they were actively visiting gun shops in the Tucson area to find a match. A holster with distinctive features is a more specific item than a mass-market backpack. That trace is ongoing. No match has been announced. The suspect's build approximately 5 feet 9 to 10 inches. Medium frame was enough to result in at least one person being stopped and questioned during a traffic stop in the weeks following the disappearance. That individual, identified by local media as Carlos Palazuelos, a delivery driver from Rio Rico, told Telemundo he had been released after investigators searched his property under warrant. He said, agents told him he resembled the figure in the footage. He was not charged. The search of his property was concluded without a public statement of findings. That episode illustrates the challenge of working from a single low-resolution image. Physical resemblance to a masked figure in a black and white still is not evidence. It is a starting point, and starting points in this investigation have repeatedly led to dead ends. There is a second thread running beneath the identity question, and it is more urgent. Nancy Guthrie has a pacemaker. That device communicates via Bluetooth, a signal that can be detected within a range of approximately 218 yards, under optimal conditions. Investigators confirmed early in the case that they were attempting to use that signal as a locating tool. The pacemaker has not produced a usable signal. There are two explanations for that. One is geographic. If Nancy is being held in a location that is beyond detection range, or inside a structure that blocks Bluetooth transmission, the device would be effectively silent. The other explanation is one investigators have not publicly ruled out. The pacemaker's silence, combined with the cadaver dogs being placed on standby, and the repeated returns to the rear section of her property, these are not separate facts. They are data points that, when placed next to each other, ask a question that no official has answered. The FBI reviewed footage from the Uber ride Nancy took on the evening of January 31st, hours before she disappeared. The driver handed over all in-car recordings. Investigators found nothing of note, nothing in her demeanor, nothing in her conversation, nothing that suggested she anticipated what was about to happen. That result closed one line of inquiry cleanly, which is itself a kind of finding. Nancy Guthrie did not know. Over 13,000 tips have come into the combined FBI and Sheriff Command Post. A 24-hour operation has been running since the first days of February. Each tip requires assessment, cross-referencing, and follow-up. The vast majority lead nowhere. The process of elimination at this scale is not inefficiency. It is the actual work of a major federal investigation. But it is slow, and it consumes resources that might otherwise be directed toward the threads still open. Forensic genetic genealogy is the process investigators have turned to for the DNA recovered at the scene. It works by comparing an unknown DNA sample against publicly available genetic databases, not CODIS, which requires prior criminal records, but consumer genealogy platforms where individuals have voluntarily submitted their DNA. From those databases, investigators build family trees. They identify possible relatives of the unknown contributor. They work outward from those relatives until they isolate a likely match. The process identified Brian Kohberger in the University of Idaho murders. It identified the Golden State Killer. It is not fast. Analysts with extensive match data in the database can sometimes produce results within days. Cases with sparse matches can take months. Where the Nancy Guthrie DNA sample falls on that spectrum has not been disclosed. What is known is that investigators are using it, and that means the DNA inside that house is clean enough and significant enough to justify the time the process requires. Every physical thread in this case has the same shape. It narrows, it gets close, and then it stalls before it closes. The glove close, but not a match. The holster distinctive, but unmatched. The pacemaker deployed, but silent. The DNA promising, but pending. The masked figure identified on camera, but not in any database. And beneath all of it, a growing complication that the physical evidence alone cannot resolve. The ransom notes. At least 3 separate communications were sent to media outlets following Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. KOLD in Tucson received one of the first. TMZ received what it described as a highly sophisticated demand involving cryptocurrency, a figure similar to the $6 million cited in earlier notes, with graphic descriptions of consequences for non-payment. The station forwarded the communication to the FBI. The notes were described by reporters who reviewed them as well-written. That is a specific characterization. Not rambling, not erratic, well-written, and they contain details about the crime scene that had not been made public. That second quality is the one that matters most. Insider details about a crime scene can come from 3 places: someone who was there, someone who was told by someone who was there, or someone with access to law enforcement information. The notes were not authenticated as genuine by any agency. The FBI confirmed awareness of them and stated they were being reviewed. Beyond that, nothing. The Guthrie family released public videos appealing to the person holding Nancy. Savannah Guthrie, her brother Cameron, and her sister Annie recorded an appeal on February 7th, stating they had received a message and were ready to listen. Savannah added, directly, "This is very valuable to us, and we will pay." The family was explicitly offering to engage. No direct contact followed, at least none that has been confirmed. That is the part of the ransom communications that forensic experts find most unusual. In cases involving ransom demands for financial payment, the abductor needs to communicate. The money cannot be transferred without a channel. If the goal of this crime was financial, the silence after multiple public overtures from a willing family, a family that said openly they would pay, does not follow the expected pattern. Either the communications are not genuine, or the person who sent them cannot respond, or they have chosen not to, for reasons that have not been established. Each of those possibilities leads somewhere different, and none of them have been eliminated. Sheriff Chris Nanos has been facing scrutiny that extends beyond the investigation itself. Pima County's Board of Supervisors held a meeting to discuss what was described as recently reported issues concerning his work history. A near-unanimous no-confidence vote was reported within his department. The sheriff has defended the investigation publicly, stating on March 23rd that investigators have good evidence in front of them and that the case will continue. But the leadership questions surrounding the department have added a layer of external pressure to an investigation that is already under a national microscope. The question that connects all of this, the ransom notes without a channel, the DNA without a match, the rear of the property without an explanation, is not a question about any one piece of evidence. It is a question about what this crime was actually built around. Because the evidence, read together, suggests something more structured than an opportunistic abduction. And the most direct evidence for that structure is not in any of the physical items recovered since February 1st. It is in a date that came 3 weeks earlier. A date that Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed this week carries significance in the investigation. A date that the Guthrie family itself has now publicly asked the Tucson community to think back on. January 11th. January 11th is 3 weeks before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Most coverage of this case mentions that date in passing. A line in a timeline, a footnote to a larger story that officially began on February 1st. But the Pima County Sheriff's Department is not treating it as a footnote, and the FBI's digital analysis team is not treating it as a footnote. And the Guthrie family, who have access to information the public does not specifically ask the Tucson community to think back to the evening of January 11th, when they issued their most recent public appeal. That is not an accident. On March 23rd, Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed to Tucson station KOLD that investigators believe something occurred on January 11th. He tied that conclusion directly to the FBI's analysis of digital equipment recovered from or near the property. He did not describe what occurred. He did not name a location. He said the interest in that date remains part of an active investigative thread, and that the work is ongoing. Think about the specificity of that statement. Not a general time frame, not the week of, January 11th. A single date, identified through digital forensic analysis, 3 weeks before an abduction that left no witnesses and almost no usable footage. That kind of precision in a federal investigation does not come from guesswork. It comes from a device log, a camera timestamp, a signal record, or a file that was accessed, modified, or deleted on a specific date. Something in the digital infrastructure of Nancy Guthrie's home, or in its immediate surroundings, registered an event on January 11th that the FBI can point to. What that event was has not been disclosed, but place it next to what else is confirmed, and a shape begins to emerge. The FBI has established that the masked figure seen at Nancy's front door on the night of January 31st had been to that property before. Not once before, more than once. Investigators confirmed the existence of images showing the suspected abductor at the residence on separate days prior to the abduction. Each visit was reconnaissance. Each visit was someone learning the property, its rhythms, its vulnerabilities, its camera positions, its coverage gaps. The rear of the home has a gap. Motion-activated cameras that captured thumbnails but not continuous video. A section of the property that cannot be reconstructed from footage after the fact. An underground structure that investigators probed with a long pole and then declined to discuss. Someone who visited that property in the weeks before January 31st would have known that gap existed. Now add what News Nation correspondent Brian Inton confirmed in the past week. FBI agents returned to the Catalina Foothills neighborhood and began asking residents specific questions. Not general questions about what they may have seen around the time of the disappearance. Specific questions. They asked about a property near Nancy Guthrie's home that had been vacated, a neighbor who moved out before she disappeared. According to Inton's reporting, agents are asking about that situation directly. The FBI has not stated that property is connected to the crime, but they are asking about it, repeatedly. And separately, in a detail that has drawn less attention than it deserves, agents asked residents for the names of individual contractors and workers active at construction sites in the neighborhood during the weeks leading up to February 1st. Not the name of the construction company, the names of individual workers. That is a specific investigative posture. It reflects a theory about how someone gained legitimate access to a residential neighborhood, moved through it without drawing suspicion, learned the layout of a specific property over multiple visits, and identified the one section of the grounds that no camera could document. A construction worker in an active build zone belongs there. They can be present on multiple days without triggering concern. They can observe a neighboring property from an elevated position, from a roofline, from a scaffold. They can note which cameras are motion activated, which angles are covered, and which are not. They can return tomorrow, and the day after, without anyone writing it down. Investigators want names because a name can be run. A name can be cross-referenced against the camera images. A name can be checked against the DNA recovered from inside the house. And January 11th, whatever occurred on that date, may be the first entry in a log that ends on the morning of February 1st. The investigation is not looking at a single night anymore. It is looking at a timeline that began at least 3 weeks earlier, and possibly longer. The question of who entered that home, and how, and when they first decided to do it, those answers are somewhere in a stretch of time that the public has barely begun to examine. That is what the spot they will not name is sitting inside. Not just a location on a property, a location at the end of a chain that started before most people know to look. If you have lived in the Catalina Foothills area, if you work in construction, if you drove through that neighborhood on January 11th or January 24th or the evening of January 31st, and saw something that seemed unremarkable at the time, the FBI tip line is still active. The family's statement was direct. No detail is too small. It may be the key. Crime Doc Network will cover every confirmed development in this investigation. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because when this case moves, it will move fast, and you will want the full breakdown as it happens, not hours after. Day 53. Here is where the investigation stands. There are no arrests. There is no named suspect. The Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI have not held a public news conference in several weeks. Sheriff Nanos issued a statement on March 23rd, confirming that investigators believe something occurred on January 11th and that the team has good evidence in front of them. That statement has not been elaborated on. The forensic genetic genealogy process is active. DNA recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home from a source that is not Nancy, not her family, and not anyone whose profile exists in the National Criminal Database is being run against. Publicly available genetic databases, in an attempt to build a family tree toward an identification. That process has produced results in other high-profile cases. It has also taken months in cases where the unknown contributor has limited genetic representation in the available databases. Where this case falls on that timeline is unknown. The cadaver dogs are on standby. The underground structure at the rear of the property has not been publicly described or named. Investigators returned to the neighborhood within the last 48 hours, asking about a vacant property and the identities of construction workers. Those inquiries are ongoing. The reward total currently stands at over $1,200,000, a combination of the FBI's confirmed reward, an anonymous donation, and the Guthrie family's publicly announced contribution. Over 13,000 tips have been logged. A 24-hour command post remains operational. On March 21st, the Guthrie family issued a statement asking the Tucson community for renewed attention to the case. They asked residents to review camera footage, text messages, journal notes, and personal observations from 3 specific dates: the evening of January 11th, January 31st, and the early morning hours of February 1st. They said someone may have information they do not realize is significant. Savannah Guthrie has made limited public appearances since the early weeks of the case. She briefly posted on Instagram this week in connection with World Down Syndrome Day, a cause she had been involved with before her mother's disappearance. She did not comment publicly on recent developments in the investigation. The family's posture over these 53 days has been measured. They have appealed directly to whoever is holding Nancy. They have offered to pay. They have acknowledged that she may already be gone, while stating they still believe in the possibility she is not. Each public statement has been carefully worded, clearly coordinated with law enforcement, and aimed at keeping a channel open that has so far produced no confirmed response. What remains unresolved at day 53 is not a list of minor loose ends. The core questions of this case: who was inside that house, what happened at the rear of the property, what the DNA will eventually tell investigators, what occurred on January 11th, are all still open. Each one is significant on its own. Together, they outline an investigation that is still moving but has not yet found the point where all its threads converge. The spot on that property that investigators keep returning to has still not been named. Nancy Guthrie has still not been found. Day 53. The investigation continues. One detail from this investigation has already changed how security professionals talk about residential camera systems in the Southwest. The cameras at the rear of Nancy Guthrie's home were motion activated. They captured thumbnails, not video. The front door had continuous recording, and that footage, limited as it was, became the centerpiece of the FBI's public appeal. The back of the property produced still images that documented nothing of use for the period investigators needed most. That gap was not a malfunction. It was a design choice that turned out to be a critical vulnerability. Home security systems built around motion-triggered cameras are common because they conserve storage and reduce false alerts. But motion-triggered systems have a specific weakness. They do not record the moments before a trigger. Anything that happens in a covered zone without triggering the sensor's slow movement, activity below the camera's detection threshold, presence in a blind spot, produces nothing. No thumbnail, no timestamp, no record. The Nancy Guthrie case is now a reference point in that conversation. If the rear of her property had continuous recording with adequate night coverage, investigators would not be returning to that section of the grounds without an explanation. They would have footage. What this case teaches us about home security is not that cameras fail, it is that the type of camera matters as much as the presence of one. The pacemaker tracking attempt is a second lesson with direct implications. Bluetooth-enabled medical devices operate within a limited range, in this case, approximately 218 yards. Law enforcement used that signal as a potential locating tool. It produced nothing. For families with elderly relatives who depend on implanted cardiac devices, that limitation is now visible in a way it was not before. Cellular-connected monitoring systems with GPS capability exist and are increasingly accessible. They would not have guaranteed a different outcome here, but they would have extended the detection range by orders of magnitude. The third element this case clarifies is the profile of a pre-planned, targeted abduction. The masked figure did not select Nancy Guthrie at random. He visited her property on multiple occasions before acting. He identified the camera positions. He knew the coverage gap existed. He returned when he was ready. That pattern repeated low-profile presence in an area before an incident is documented in law enforcement literature as a hallmark of targeted crimes against vulnerable individuals. Recognizing an unfamiliar person in a residential area on multiple occasions and reporting that observation to local authorities is not an overreaction. In this case, it may have been the one thing that could have interrupted the timeline before January 31st. What this case teaches us about pre-planned abductions is that the crime visible on camera is rarely where the crime began. 53 days in, that is the clearest line from the evidence to something actionable. The investigation is still running, and what it finds next will matter. 53 days. The FBI is back in that neighborhood. The DNA is still in the lab. The underground structure at the rear of Nancy Guthrie's property has still not been publicly named or described. And January 11th, whatever happened on that evening 3 weeks before she disappeared, is still the date investigators keep returning to without explanation. That is where this investigation stands today, not at a conclusion, not at an arrest. At a point where every confirmed thread is still open, and every silence from law enforcement is still deliberate. Crime Doc Network will be here when that changes. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and check back. Because when the DNA returns a match, when January 11th gets an explanation, when that location on the property finally gets named, this channel will have the full breakdown, confirmed, sourced, and ready. If you were in the Catalina Foothills area on January 11th or January 24th, or the night of January 31st, and you saw something that seemed like nothing at the time, the FBI tip line is still open. The family's message has not changed. No detail is too small. One question stays with this case regardless of what comes next. Someone in that neighborhood saw something in the weeks before February 1st. They may not know yet what they saw. Nancy Guthrie, still missing. The investigation continues.